Chapter 5. For the next few days the heat wave continued. The thick, hot blanket of tropical air that smothered the city showed no sign of going anywhere. The investigation of the massacre at Beekman and Water showed no sign of going anywhere either, as far as Schaefer and Rash could tell. But they weren't on the inside. They were banned from the scene, and no one they spoke to knew who was handling the case. There were rumours that some special federal task force was involved. Schaefer made it plain that he didn't like the sound of that. "Hey, it isn't necessarily a cover-up," Rash reminded him. "For all we know, the whole thing could be taped and ready to go. The feds do the job sometimes." "Since when is this their job?" "Since they said it is," Rash answered. "Come on, Schaefer, let it go." "It's not their city," Schaefer said. "It's not just yours either. When some asshole comes in and massacres the punks I've been trying to nail for the past 3 years, Schaefer, you're not in the narco anymore. You think that means it's over?" "I think that means it's not our problem." Schaefer was clearly not convinced of that, but he stopped arguing. It wasn't their problem. The feds had taken over, and plain old NYPD homicide detectives were not welcome. Rash wasn't very happy about that either. For one thing, he knew that whenever something this weird and violent went down once and the cops weren't all over it, it was likely to happen again. The idea of looking at another scene of carnage like the 5th floor of that tenement made Rash sick to his stomach, and he had to admit that he didn't see much sign that the feds were doing anything. No G-men were combing the NYPD files or questioning the cops who patrolled that beat, or talking to any of the guys in either homicide or narco. He considered calling in the press, maybe making an anonymous call to Newsday, just to goose the feds a little. But reporters were a pain in the ass, pretty nearly as much his natural enemies as the feds were. And it wasn't as if he had nothing better to do. He and Schaefer were keeping busy. The day after the massacre, for example, a tourist from Missouri took a wrong turn, wound up on the Staten Island ferry instead of the boat to Liberty Island, and went berserk, taking 3 commuters hostage. One of the hostages knifed another, and Schaefer and Rash got to clean up the mess. Rash got to spend the evening listening to lawyers argue over whether the tourist could be charged as an accomplice to attempted murder, while Schaefer tried to get the tourist's family back in Missouri on the phone and worked through a maze of cousins and friends. The day after that, the big event came when a complicated deal between Jamaican drug dealers, Somali gun runners, and Serbian terrorists went bad in Tribeca, of all places, when the Jamaicans decided to keep everything for themselves. After the dust settled and most of the participants were hauled away to either the lockup or the morgue, Rash got to help haul a truckload of confiscated heavy weapons to the police lab on West 20th for investigation. Rash didn't even recognize some of the stuff. The plain old automatic weapons he knew, and the rocket-propelled grenades, though he had no idea why the Jamaicans would have wanted them. But some of the contraband looked more like spare jet parts than weapons. And maybe, given the Serbian connection, it was spare jet parts. Schaefer was ordered to stay away from the scene on that one. Apparently Captain McComb didn't trust him within reach of 10 tons of military ordnance. Instead, he spent his time interviewing survivors, trying to figure out just who had shot who with what. That night, 2 punks eager to impress someone tried to drop Schaefer from ambush. The first shot missed, and they never got a second. Both lived. One went straight to the tombs, the other did a month in the hospital first. And that stuff was ordinary enough, at least by the standards of NYPD homicide. But then, the next day, there was the police firing range. Rash and Schaefer weren't there when it happened. They hadn't had time to worry about their marksmanship. Rash probably wouldn't have bothered anyway, in this heat, even if his backlog of paperwork had vanished and the whole damn city had gone a week without so much as jaywalking. And Schaefer, Rash sometimes thought, used the whole damn city as his firing range. The range was in the basement of the police academy on West 20th, downstairs from the police lab. It was open to anyone licensed to carry a gun inside the city limits. Officers were expected to practice there occasionally. Most of them did, including Rash and Schaefer. But neither of them was there when it happened. It was late afternoon, and half a dozen assorted law enforcement personnel and civilian big shots were on the firing line, blowing away paper targets and griping about the heat whenever the noise level dropped enough to allow conversation. Fresh targets fluttered wildly in the breeze from the ventilators as they were cranked down range, but the place was a steam bath all the same. Tailored jackets lay in heaps on the floor at civilian feet, and none of the blue uniform shirts were buttoned all the way up. Probation officer Richard K. Stillman rattled down the stairs from the street and marched happily along the basement corridor, untroubled by the heat. Life was good. He'd hit big at OTB yesterday, and he had a hot date lined up, with an hour to loll. Something seemed to shimmer in the corridor ahead of him, but he paid no attention. He'd seen plenty of odd effects from the heat the last few days, and the air in this place was dusty enough for them. He swung easily through the glass door and waved to Joe Salvati, who was manning the cash register. He glanced at the display cases and ammunition safe and watched through the windows for a moment. He didn't notice that the door took much longer than usual to close behind him. "Hey, Joe," Stillman said, as he pulled back his jacket, revealing the butt of a .45 and a shoulder holster. "How's it going?" "Not bad," Salvati said. Stillman drew the automatic. "Figured I'd get in a little practice," he said. The other man smiled. "Can't hurt," he said. Stillman hesitated. He wasn't in any hurry. He was taking it easy today. The muffled sounds of shooting could be heard from the range. Stillman glanced at the windows again, just in time to see one of the doors to the range shatter spectacularly. The firing suddenly stopped as everyone turned to look at this unexpected phenomenon. Stillman's jaw dropped. "What in the hell did that?" he asked. Then someone screamed, and blood sprayed across the carpeted shooting platform at one position. "Hey!" Stillman shouted. He charged through the ruined door, pistol raised. "What the—" he began. He never finished that sentence, or any other sentence ever again. He went down, blood spraying. Salvati stepped back, startled, trying to see what was going on, but he couldn't find a clear view. He could hear screams, and he saw blood on one of the windows, but half the lights in the range seemed to have gone out suddenly, and all he could make out was frantic movement. He couldn't see who was doing what. Was it some kind of brawl? Was someone going for the cash register? He couldn't imagine a stupider crime than to attempt robbing the police shooting range, but thieves could be amazingly stupid. After all, Salvati thought, he was probably the only guy in there who wasn't armed. He hesitated. He had his choice of several weapons if he wanted one, but he hesitated. He couldn't see what was happening, but he heard shots now, and more screams and loud thumping. What the hell was going on in there? The guys back there had guns. They were shooting. At least half of them were trained professionals. What could he do that they couldn't, except maybe walk into a crossfire? But maybe something heavier than handguns would help. He turned to look at the display cases. Something hit him on the back of the head, and Joe Salvati went down. Down and out. The next thing he knew was the sound of boots crunching on broken glass, flashlights moving in the darkness, and someone leaning over him and shouting, "This one's alive!" And then they were all around him, telling him to lie still. The paramedics were coming. And had he seen what had happened? He didn't know what to tell them. He tried to ask who was hurt in there and who was dead, but no one would give him a straight answer. "This one's alive," the voice had said. He waited for the words to be repeated, for someone to say there was another survivor, but he hadn't heard anything of the kind by the time he was carried out. He'd heard a man retching. He'd heard hardened cops saying, "Oh my God," in shocked tones, but he hadn't heard anyone mention other survivors. Detective Rash had gone off duty at 6 o'clock that day, on time for once, and he was at home alone relaxing. His wife Shari had taken the kids to a park concert. Rash hadn't made it in time to go with them, but he'd found a note and a microwave dinner waiting for him when he'd got home. He thought about going after them, but trying to find 3 people in the mob at the park just sounded like too much effort right now. Instead, he decided to stay home and enjoy the quiet. The quiet was good, but he'd really have preferred seeing Shari. It seemed like weeks since he'd seen her for more than a few minutes over breakfast. Even on his days off, she was usually out doing temp work somewhere, doing her bit to help catch up on some of those bills. When the heat wave broke and tempers cooled, maybe he'd be home more and get to see more of her. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe it wasn't the heat. Maybe it was just city living getting to everyone, the way it was getting to him. He sipped tepid coffee and tossed the remains of a healthy gourmet herbs and chicken entree into the trash. Rash had 8 years to go till his pension. 8 more years of living in New York City on a cop's pay, in a neighbourhood in Queens that had been pretty decent when they bought the house, but was now just the best they could afford. 8 more years of microwave dinners and mismatched work schedules. This evening was one of those times when he wondered whether it was all worth it. New York cops generally still had a pretty good rep, despite the latest round of scandals. Not like some big city departments he could name. If he decided to move out, he could probably land a high-ranking job with some small-town force, or with the county mounties in one of those big square states out west. The Pacific Northwest might be nice. Shari evidently thought so too, as the swarm of stupid plastic magnets on the refrigerator no longer held a display of the kids' homework. Instead, they supported a growing constellation of real estate ads and travel brochures from Alaska and Washington State. The hint wasn't lost on Rash, but he'd been in New York for so long, damn near his entire life, and he put so much into the job here, trying to save a little bit of the city from itself, that it was hard to think about giving it up, even for his family. His family that he almost never saw. At least he had a family. There on the fridge, in an upper corner that Shari hadn't yet got to with her brochures, a yellow plastic smiley face held up a photo of Rash and Schaefer, taken on the occasion of nailing a particularly vicious drug kingpin from uptown, a punk called Errol G. In the picture, Rash was smiling so broadly his mustache looked as if it were upside down, but Schaefer was playing old stone face as usual. Standing stiff as a lamppost, his face like an undertaker's nightmare. Schaefer didn't have a family, so far as Rash knew. Didn't even have any close friends. He'd mentioned a brother once, but Rash hadn't asked about him, and Schaefer sure hadn't volunteered anything. There were some buddies, mostly in the military or law enforcement, but none of them seemed close. Certainly no closer than Rash himself was. And Rash, after 6 years as Schaefer's partner, wasn't sure he knew Schaefer at all. What the hell kept Schaefer going anyway? It wasn't a woman. Rash had seen Schaefer's apartment once, and there wasn't any doubt that Schaefer lived alone. No other human being could have put up with that place. Stained ceilings and cracked windows and the TV blaring from next door through paper-thin walls. But the bed was made with military precision and razor-sharp creases at the corners. The floor was spotless. Everything was folded and sorted and filed away. The goddamn coffee cups in the kitchen cupboard had all their handles pointing in the same direction, for Christ's sake. Nobody but Schaefer could have lived there. So what drove Schaefer? Why was he a cop? He could have landed a job somewhere else. There was always work for a big, smart, tough guy who wasn't afraid to tackle anything. So why was he still with the department? He wasn't after any pension. Schaefer never gave a damn about money. If he'd wanted a pension, he could have stayed in the military instead of becoming a cop. So far as Rash knew, it had been Schaefer's idea to switch. Maybe he hadn't been seeing enough action in the army. Or was it righteous anger that drove him? Maybe. Outrage at the things people did to each other. He talked about New York as his city, but somehow Rash couldn't see it as his motivation. He didn't think Schaefer meant so much that it was his city to protect, as that it was his city as his turf, the place where he was the boss male, and anyone else who showed up claiming to be tough was a challenge. If that was it, it was pure macho dominance at work, not anger. Rash and Schaefer had been partners for 6 years now, and Rash wasn't sure at all that he'd ever yet really seen Schaefer get mad. Which, when he thought about it, made him a little nervous. What kind of man could go through the crap that Schaefer went through without losing his temper every so often? He'd got that far when the doorbell rang. Damn, he said, putting down the coffee. The doorbell rang again. I'm coming, he yelled as he trotted down the front hall. The doorbell rang a third time. I'm coming, God damn it, he shouted as he grabbed the doorknob. Rash yanked the front door open and found Schaefer standing on the stoop. Schaefer's expression was exactly the same as in the photo on the fridge, and for a moment Rash had an odd feeling of unreality, as if the past and present were tripping over each other. Rash had dumped his jacket and tie the moment he got in the door of his house and was standing there in a sweaty undershirt. Schaefer still had the crease in his pants, the knot of his tie tight and perfect. Rash didn't think that was because Schaefer actually cared about his appearance. It was because the rules said what to wear, and that wasn't a rule Schaefer cared enough to break. They hit again, Schaefer said in a growl, interrupting Rash's thought. The police range on 20th. The goddamn police academy. You want to go, or you want to watch Green Acres? You could say hello, Rash said. He didn't need to ask who Schaefer meant. He was shaken and trying to hide it. He knew guys at 20th Street, and the image of dangling, skinned corpses with familiar faces was growing in the back of his mind. Schaefer didn't bother to answer. He simply waited for Rash to decide, in or out. From that, Rash knew that he and Schaefer weren't supposed to be on this case. The feds probably wanted it kept quiet. The feds probably wanted to handle it themselves. But those imagined faces of fellow cops weren't exactly encouraging Rash to go along with the feds. Rash sighed. Okay, what the hell? Green Acres isn't on tonight anyway. Let me get my piece.